welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a really unflinching look at the highly interior life of intimacy. We're talking about the moments, the beliefs, the attachments that form, despite our best intentions, despite what our rational minds are telling us.
Right.
This is an exploration that really strips away all the easy answers, all the comforting stories we tell ourselves, and, every promise of a clean resolution that we tend to cling to.
It's an essential deep dive, I think, into the architecture of confusion. The confusion that's just inherent in intimate life.
Yes, exactly.
Our source material today is a series of essays from a truly remarkable book, Ghosts of Sex.
A powerful title.
It is. And it's a work that fundamentally challenges the way we process and, narrativize our experiences of desire and connection.
And before we really get into the meat of it, we should probably give some context on the source itself.
We should.
The author of this collection is Pedro Malha. He's a philosopher and the founder of what's known as the Ghosts movement.
Right, and that context is absolutely vital.
It is, because this isn't just a collection of personal essays. It's a profound philosophical exercise. It's about looking very, very closely at lived emotional experience without the safety net of, a summary or a self-help guide at the end.
That's it. This book is part of Malha's wider series, the Ghosts of series, which really aims to pull apart the way we organize our lived experience into these neat chronological stories.
So our mission today, then, is to explore these individual, often very contradictory recognitions about sex and attachment.
Yes, and focusing specifically on what they reveal about the limits of clarity. We're looking at the reality that we often live inside these unresolved tensions, and that the inability to resolve them, well, it might be a feature of being human, not a flaw.
That immediately changes the stakes, doesn't it?
Completely.
We're not here to find a lesson or a takeaway. We're here to, identify the contours of the tension itself.
To just sit with it.
Okay, so let's unpack this structural decision first, because it really is the foundation of the whole book, and honestly, what makes it so challenging.
It is.
Malha makes it very clear, right from the start, that Ghosts of Sex does not move forward in the way we expect a book to move. Why is that refusal of, traditional coherence so radical?
It's a direct critique, I think, of this cultural impulse we have to turn every experience into a neat, digestible object.
A story with a moral at the end.
Precisely. Malha explicitly states the book does not build a single argument. It doesn't lay out a firm, fixed position or promise that accumulation of knowledge that will make you feel, wiser by the final page.
Which is what we expect from nonfiction, right?
It's exactly what we expect. We expect chapter 1 to build to chapter 2, and that by the end we've achieved some kind of synthesis. This book just rejects that promise entirely.
We're trained to seek the arc, the progression from, say, ignorance to insight or from a problem to a solution. But here, the structure is designed to thwart that.
Completely. It offers a set of recognitions that, well, they don't need to speak to one another in any particular order, and critically, they do not resolve into a shape that you can hold all at once.
So it's not like pieces of a puzzle.
Not at all. Think of it like this. If most deep dives into human experience are trying to be a meticulously edited documentary, this book is more like a collection of high-contrast, beautiful, but totally non-sequential photographs.
I like that analogy.
Each image is true in its own right, but they don't form a timeline. And they certainly don't form a final conclusion. Each essay has to stand alone, specifically because it's incomplete in its own particular way.
So the incompleteness is the intended state.
That's the point.
They aren't fragments of a larger truth that the reader is supposed to piece together. They are whole moments that just refuse to join into a system. They maintain their own internal contradiction rather than being, corrected or explained by the essays that come before or after.
Yes, and this is where the philosophy of the Ghosts movement really comes into play.
Gotcha.
The ghosts are those emotional realities that persist without resolution. They're there, you feel them, you acknowledge them, but they don't just disappear because you've named them. So by keeping the essays isolated, the book mirrors how we actually live through these intense, confusing moments. They often do feel self-contained, completely unmoored from the official timeline of our lives.
That makes a lot of sense. The lack of synthesis isn't a failure of the structure.
I know.
It's a fidelity to the lived experience.
Exactly. And this directly impacts how sex itself is defined in these essays. It's not treated as a category that can be mapped or stabilized or reclaimed.
Which is all the popular language of therapy and self-help today. Reclaim your sexuality.
Precisely. Here, sex appears purely as a series of lived moments. often contradictory, deeply unresolved, and sometimes, barely coherent even to the person who is inside of them.
So the essays don't even operate on the assumption that coherence is possible.
Or even desirable, maybe. They remain with the fact that many of our experiences are only known in pieces, remembered unevenly, and understood differently every single time they're revisited. It's a deep admission that clarity is a moving target.
And that leads right to this resistance against the common urge to clarify everything.
Hmm.
When you write about intimate experiences, the temptation is always to sort them out, right? To extract the lessons, to draw these firm lines between what was healthy and what was unhealthy. The mind just wants to categorize.
And Malha's work actively, and I think bravely, resists this therapeutic or moral impulse. The essays refuse to treat sex as something that must be clarified or explained or judged.
So they're not trying to explain why something happened.
Or what should have happened instead. No. Instead, they stay completely inside the emotional feeling of being there. That place where certainty was absent, where desire was just stronger than clarity, where attachment formed without permission.
Or where meaning was just assumed rather than actually agreed upon.
Exactly. It's all about that internal state.
This shift in focus it's profound. It suggests that the book is far less concerned with the physical or, relational mechanics of sex.
Almost not at all.
And almost entirely focused on the interior landscape. The interpretation, the feeling, the emotional negotiation that happens alongside it, before it, and long, long after it.
It is an entirely emotional filter. Each essay uses a very narrow angle of attention. It's staying, for example, only with the feeling of having been wanted without being truly known, or remaining exclusively with the experience of staying in a situation long after your intellectual recognition has already arrived.
So the key takeaway from this structural choice is that these moments are not steps in a process.
No, they're separate. Self-contained recognitions, unwilling to be corrected or assimilated by the others. The book tells you that our experience is often lived as well as repetition without clarity, or clarity without movement.
I think we need to keep coming back to that idea, clarity without movement.
Yeah.
Because that is so contrary to our cultural expectation.
Yeah.
We assume once we know something, we're supposed to act on it.
Hmm.
But these sources suggest, well, that's not how it works at all.
Not at all. The structure is designed to make you uncomfortable with the lack of progress. It forces you to sit in the realization that recognizing an emotional truth doesn't automatically grant you the agency to escape it.
Okay, let's move on and focus specifically on this deliberate choice of the emotional lens, which we just touched on. The source material notes that the essays actively do not focus on the body as an object of analysis or physical sensation. So if the physical encounter is minimized, what's left?
What's left is a pure, deliberate dive into interiority.
Okay.
The attention is placed purely on the subtle, often hidden movement of feeling. Longing, hope, confusion, anticipation, disappointment, attachment, and all the quiet negotiations people make with themselves in the privacy of their own minds.
And that's a crucial distinction, isn't it? These interior states are treated as fundamental conditions that simply accompany intimate life.
Exactly. They aren't problems to be solved or symptoms to be cured by some external action.
So if I feel immense confusion about a casual encounter, Moll is suggesting I should treat that confusion not as failure of my character or a sign I need more therapy,
Right.
but as a condition of the encounter itself.
That's the core reframe. The confusion is simply, it's the air you are breathing in that moment. It's not some specific personal malfunction.
Okay, so if we're not solving problems, then what is the goal?
Well, this brings us to what I think is the most provocative philosophical constraint in the whole book. Recognition as an end in itself.
Wait, I need to stop you there, because this runs counter to nearly all contemporary self-help and, popular philosophy.
Everything, yes.
We are taught that self-awareness is just the first step. It's the first step towards self-improvement. Why is Mala so insistent that recognition is the end?
The essays are absolutely explicit here. They do not offer guidance. They do not suggest how to behave differently in the future. The foundational idea of the ghosts movement is that if you treat recognition as merely a step toward improvement, you pollute the recognition itself.
Oh, so?
You turn the act of noticing into a tool. You're already looking for how to use it. Mala argues that recognition in its pure form has to be treated as an end in itself, a final action.
So the act of naming an experience doesn't imply that it can or even should be fixed, or that it should have turned out differently.
Not at all. You simply acknowledge its existence and its power over you in that moment.
You just see it for what it was.
Exactly. The value is in the truthful naming, not in the subsequent manipulation of the outcome.
Hmm.
To recognize in this context is to accept the reality of what was lived, regardless of how messy or incomplete or contradictory it might have been.
And this constraint is what allows the book to achieve its radical refusal of moral framing.
That's the connection.
That moral neutrality seems incredibly difficult to maintain when you're discussing vulnerability and desire, especially given how quickly our culture assigns roles like victim and villain.
Oh, instantly. And that is what the book steadfastly refuses to do. There is absolutely no attempt to assign blame or virtue, or to divide people into those who acted rightly or wrongly.
It doesn't frame sex as a site of moral failure or moral achievement.
No. It stays instead with the raw ambiguity of desire, the unevenness of power that is often just there in the room, and the ways people often participate in situations they don't fully understand or feel able to leave.
That acknowledgement of participation without full understanding, that seems incredibly honest.
It is.
Because it grants that people can be both an agent and a participant at the same time, even in really confusing situations.
It's about honoring the state of being caught. The writing stays with moments as they were lived. It acknowledges vulnerability, imbalance, loss of footing, that feeling of the ground being unstable beneath you. And what's more, Malah's approach makes a point of saying that not every moment of confusion or regret can be explained through a single dominating framework, like, for example, trauma, or just a simple failure of communication.
And how does the text manage that tension? Because refusing a single framework like trauma could, for some readers, risk minimizing real harm.
It's a fair question. It manages it by insisting on nuance over a monolithic explanation. The essays acknowledge the presence of harm and vulnerability without organizing every difficult encounter around it.
So it allows for the unevenness.
It allows for the unevenness. The reality that desire doesn't always have to be justified by logic, and that intensity doesn't always have to be interrogated as a symptom of some past wound. The focus is on the emotional state right then. It recognizes that our interior lives are often just too dense to be reduced to a single cause and effect chain.
So it allows for the possibility that the confusion or the regret is simply a byproduct of two incomplete, complex people interacting.
Yes.
Not necessarily a deeper failing or wound on one side or the other.
Exactly. It's about letting a messy experience remain messy, rather than imposing a tidy narrative of healing or self-improvement onto it. It's really an exercise in intellectual patience.
And I suppose the density of the prose, as the source points out, is meant to mirror the density of the experience itself.
I think so. It resists easy summary because the experiences themselves don't resolve neatly at the end of an encounter. The structure asks you, the reader, to enter each essay on its own terms without expecting it to explain what comes next or what you should do next week. The commitment is to truthfulness of description, not the utility of the information.
Let's move into the emotional heart of the book then, where these contradictory recognitions really manifest. Let's start with the essay that captures that subtle, slow burn longing, wanting more than was ever offered.
A powerful one.
What's so striking is how this wanting settles in so quietly. It's not fed by explicit declarations, but by suggestion, tone, proximity, availability.
The small thing.
It arises in the absence of a promise.
This is what Mala calls the slow start. And it's so important because it doesn't arrive as some irrational excess or an immediate demand. Initially, it feels like a perfectly reasonable, proportional response to what is already there.
Right.
Often there was no declaration, no contract that you could later point to as a failure or a deception. What existed was simply possibility.
And possibility, the source suggests, has its own gravity.
Immense gravity. It pulls feeling toward it without requiring any confirmation. It invites deep internal investment without formally asking for it.
So you invest in the potential version of the connection.
Yes.
Rather than the facts of the current arrangement.
And this investment is subtle. It's the extra thought you give it, the quiet anticipation, the way you might adjust your time or your availability. It's the self doing the work of attachment long before the relationship has justified it.
And the devastating realization of the mismatch. The fact that the terms are never going to shift. That doesn't arrive in a single dramatic moment, does it?
No, it seeps in.
Yeah.
It seeps in slowly through quiet, constant repetition of the same boundary.
So you start to realize it's a kind of asynchronous movement.
That's a great way to put it. The self has continued to grow and elaborate and invest, while the other person has remained exactly where they always were, operating strictly within the limits they probably set from the very beginning. You realize what you are carrying has simply It's outgrown the container it was placed in.
But the container hasn't changed its size or shape.
Not at all.
And this imbalance comes from a mismatch of emotional depth, not betrayal.
Yeah.
The other person may be entirely consistent. They may never have misrepresented what they could give, which makes the pain so much harder to manage.
That's the acute difficulty of it. There's no one to blame. You can't point to a lie. The only betrayal, if you can even call it that, is the self's own quiet, unauthorized emotional expansion. You realize you're holding the equivalent of a huge, heavy object in a small, delicate box, and the fact that the box won't expand. That's not the box's fault.
And yet this wanting persists. It's a stubbornness of feeling that refuses to respond to logic or information. You can know intellectually that nothing more is coming, and yet you still lean forward emotionally.
And the sources highlight that this persistence is not necessarily naive. It's a quieter, more determined form of hope that lives right alongside full intellectual awareness. Wanting doesn't just dissolve when it's corrected by reality.
So what's it shaped by?
It's shaped by attachment, by memory, by imagination, none of which operate according to the rules of logic or reason. They are emotional systems running on their own internal time.
And the source material attributes this persistence to a quiet loyalty.
Yes, and it's loyalty not necessarily to the other person, but loyalty to the feeling itself.
To the wanting.
To the wanting. Letting go of it can feel like erasing the version of yourself that first noticed the possibility, the person who felt that surge of hope, that capacity for deep feeling. If you let go, it feels like a betrayal of your own emotional history, a declaration that the most expansive version of yourself at that moment was a fool.
So you hold on to the want to preserve the self who is capable of feeling that much.
That's it. That is a profound observation.
Yeah.
The fear woven into this loyalty is the fear that if you stop wanting here in this situation, maybe the capacity to want deeply might diminish overall.
Wow.
So the protection comes at the cost of self-editing. You're trimming your emotional edges to fit the available space, which internally remains completely unresolved. The want persists, shaped by limitation, sustained by hope, held in tension between knowledge and feeling. It's just a highly complex state of emotional inertia.
Okay, so if that's how desire can start quietly, let's move to the adjacent and equally complex essay, believing it meant something. This tackles how profound meaning arises not through declaration or agreement, but purely through interpretation.
And it slips in so insidiously, doesn't it? Through a certain look, particular timing, and implied tone in a text message. It starts not as a grand vision, but as just a subtle shift in orientation. What felt casual yesterday now feels charged with significance.
And the mind is always looking for that.
The human mind is always seeking coherence. It's trying to construct a navigable reality, so it naturally fills in the gaps, and it infers patterns where maybe there are none.
So neutrality becomes loaded. The absence of a denial starts to feel like an affirmation.
Yes. And the absence of clarity becomes room for belief rather than a necessary warning sign.
Exactly. The self believes without needing a fully articulated two-sided argument because the emotional grammar of it feels so deeply familiar. We know what closeness feels like, and when proximity starts to mimic that, the mind just runs ahead and assigns the meaning.
And this belief quickly becomes what the essay calls lived reality.
It's not just a thought that you can rationally dismiss. It's emotionally substantial. It alters the texture of your daily life. You literally live inside the belief, regardless of its status in, shared objective reality.
And that is the problem when the contradiction arrives.
Right.
A casual sentence from the other person, a long, unexplained absence, a sudden return to formality. Because the belief was lived, it doesn't immediately dissolve, and that's that emotional lag we talked about earlier. The emotional system carries forward what has mattered to it, and that belief, that interpretation, it mattered deeply, even if it wasn't reciprocated in the way you imagined.
The emotional reality lags so far behind the factual reality. You can know the truth, but the feeling persists because the belief structure was so substantial. So the quiet shame, what the source calls the humiliation, isn't about being rejected, which is an external event.
No.
It's an internal exposure.
The humiliation is of having believed, of having read significance where none was explicitly offered. It's the shame of internal exposure, of being caught operating on a reality that was built entirely within your own mind. It feels like this immense vulnerability has been exposed, even if the other person is entirely unaware of the depth of your internal architecture.
But even here, Malho's work resists simplifying it. It's not accurate to say nothing was there.
No, because something was there. It was felt. It shaped your attention and your attachment. It consumed your time and your energy.
Right.
And that's the key nuance. The fact that the meaning was not shared in the same way does not reduce the original experience to a mere fantasy. It resists being categorized simply as a mistake.
Yeah.
It suggests it arose from engagement and emotional attentiveness, not simple stupidity. The essay asks only that it be recognized as something that was lived fully, even if it was only on one side.
And that acceptance of a non-reciprocal emotional reality is what defines this whole deep dive, really.
Mm-hmm.
So if interpretation can create a substantial reality, let's delve into what happens when that feeling solidifies into an emotional bond outside of our conscious choice.
Yeah.
We're talking about attachment without permission.
Yes.
This discusses how closeness is not something we always enter into deliberately, and it defies that cultural narrative of self-governance and personal agency.
This is such a powerful essay because it focuses on how bonds form in these constrained spaces, connections that are explicitly framed as casual or temporary or low stakes.
Despite acknowledged limits.
Exactly. And when attachment forms anyway, the sources describe it as a quiet failure of self-governance.
A quiet failure.
It's deeply unsettling because intellectually, we rely on the idea that clarity protects us from unchosen entanglement. We believe if we know the rules, we can control the emotional outcome.
But the reality Mala points to is that attachment forms even in full knowledge of what will not happen.
Yes.
You can have the most crystal clear, rational understanding that this person won't commit or won't stay. You can accept that knowledge completely and still have your emotional landscape organize itself entirely around their presence.
This reveals a core, unavoidable feature of being human. Emotional bonds can form simply through sustained contact, through the ordinary, non-dramatic act of being recognized over time. It doesn't need a contract or an agreement. The attachment isn't a choice. It's an organic, almost unavoidable response to proximity.
And the result is this profoundly isolating experience, this double life. You're carrying an attachment you can't justify to the person, or sometimes even to yourself, and it leads to this corrosive shame and self-scolding.
Yes, the shame is corrosive because you feel like you should be able to think your way out of the feeling. You try to use reason to dissolve the bond, but the attachment, it doesn't respond to scrutiny or self-correction.
So you end up alone with a feeling that you've deemed illegitimate.
And that loneliness is amplified by the fact that the person who sparked the feeling is totally unaware of the depth of your interior struggle.
So the source proposes that attachment without permission is not a malfunction of a poorly regulated self. It's a feature of being human.
It's framed as an emotional fact rather than a moral one. The crucial insight here is that clarity does not grant control over disappearance. To deny the legitimacy of this kind of attachment is to deny something ordinary and pervasive in human life.
Clarity operates on one register,
The intellectual,
and attachment operates on another.
a much deeper neurological register. They don't always override each other. You learn the very difficult lesson that you can be careful and informed and completely honest and still be unexpectedly moved and profoundly affected.
That leads perfectly into the paradox of validation in feeling chosen and losing ground.
Yes.
Being chosen often arrives as a relief, right? A solution to a long-held internal anxiety. But the position is described so starkly as a ledge, not solid ground.
The relief arrives because it lands on old absences. It feels like a long-awaited correction to earlier rejections or internal feelings of inadequacy. But precisely because it is relief, the position is inherently vulnerable.
So the sudden validation sharpens your awareness of how easily it could be withdrawn.
Absolutely. You're thrilled to be there, but you're hyper-aware of the edge.
And the loss of ground begins not with a demand from the other person, but with self-adaptation. Small accommodations, a willingness to smooth over discomfort or adjust your behavior.
This is what the essay calls the shifting gravity. The core of your internal validation moves outside of your own center. The self begins to reorganize around the mere fact of having been selected.
And there's this unspoken internal contract.
There is. If someone chose you, you must remain choosable. And this leads to a quiet, insidious shrinking where the self becomes slightly more cautious, less spontaneous, more attentive to external cues, not through force, but through a kind of anxious consent driven by the desire to maintain that relief.
So affirmation coexists with loss. The self feels wanted and diminished at the very same time.
Yes.
The loss isn't always concrete, but it's a subtle erosion of internal solidity because your footing depends entirely on ongoing approval and validation from an external source.
And this is often the moment where the relationship transforms from being about two people connecting to being about one person maintaining a carefully curated self-image for the other. The attention becomes more important than the content of the connection.
That brings us to the next, very honest essay. Wanting to be wanted more than wanting them. This just strips the concept of desire of its outward focus and turns it right back inward.
The recognition here arrives later, quietly naming an internal tilt, desire that is curved back on itself. It was sustained not by genuine curiosity about the other person, their history, their inner life, their complexity, but by the profound way their attention made something inside the self feel coherent or validated or anchored, even if it was only briefly. The desire was for their gaze, their affirmation, their choosing, not necessarily for them.
The other person becomes essentially a surface, a mirror whose primary role is just to want you.
That's it. Their value is the confirmation they provide, not their subjectivity or their unique perspective.
And this is a critical distinction because it reframes the whole dynamic.
Yeah.
The affirmation is real, but it's impersonal. It attaches to an image or a version of the self that the other person reflects back.
Exactly. And because the value is instrumental, the loss that's felt in the aftermath is purely internal. What you miss in their absence is not the relationship, but the way you felt when they were looking.
So the self misses the feeling of having been anchored, not the person who provided the anchor.
Precisely.
That realization must be profoundly stripping. It takes away the romanticized narrative of tragic love, and it just exposes the raw human vulnerability that seeks external recognition when internal value feels contingent.
It does. It removes the grand narrative and replaces it with an internal diagnosis. And the wanting persists even once you've named it because it's rooted in that history of needing validation. The essays don't suggest this feeling just disappears because you've analyzed it. You've simply recognized a deeper, more enduring need beneath the temporary desire for a specific person.
We've established that clarity does not guarantee action. Now we have to address that gap explicitly with staying when you already knew. The contradiction here is that knowing arrives quietly and is fully acknowledged, but the action leaving arrives much, much later.
The common cultural story dictates that clarity produces movement, right? Once the truth is known, the relationship should end. But lived experience, as Malha notes, just doesn't obey that sequence.
So staying in this context, it's not a state of ignorance.
No, it feels like painful deliberation, weighing the known cost of the present against the unknown cost of disruption.
You might tell yourself you're just waiting for confirmation or waiting for the right moment, but underneath all that is a deeper kind of dread, the fear of being wrong about when to leave.
Yes.
It's as though the timing carries this immense moral weight, and if you leave too soon, you'll have wasted the investment.
And that inertia has a profound cost. The nature of the intimacy itself changes. Sex becomes something quieter, flatter, more procedural.
It's no longer charged with illusion or possibility.
No. You're not there to discover what it is. You already know what it is not. You're there because leaving feels more disruptive, or because the cost of maintaining the familiar, albeit imperfect pattern is just spread so thinly across the days.
This creates a unique mental state, a double consciousness. You're physically present, you're engaging in the motions of intimacy, but you are simultaneously observing your own, staying with this deep sense of unease.
Noticing the persistent gap between what you feel and what you do.
Exactly.
And that gap is the crucial insight here. The cultural story is wrong. Knowing is not the hard part. Action is the slow, agonizing, difficult thing. Recognizing the truth is instantaneous, but overcoming the weight of inertia, habit, and the fear of the unknown is a long, protracted process.
So you're left with the awareness that you possess the knowledge required to leave, but not the current capacity.
Devastating, but true. It's a perfect description of emotional inertia.
Let's shift to the essay, Mistaking Intensity for Truth, which is about how the loudness of a feeling can substitute for its correctness.
Intensity arrives with a psychological urgency that just demands attention. It treats its own strength as its own justification. It substitutes raw power for rational correctness.
The feeling feels less like a simple inner state and more like a verifiable fact of the world.
Exactly. Because it's so overwhelming, it must be important.
And this creates what the source calls the narrative trap. The emotional surge produces an immediate, compelling narrative. This must mean something enormous.
And doubt is silenced. Because questioning the intensity feels like questioning your own vitality or your capacity for a deep, meaningful experience. If you question it, you feel like you're diluting the experience itself, betraying its initial force. The more overwhelming the sensation, the more true the accompanying story becomes.
The self thinks, if I felt this strongly, it must be the core truth of this situation.
Yes. But when that intensity fades, often without delivering what it promised, a grand commitment, a permanent shift, a lasting love, the self experiences what Mala terms an epistemic shock.
Epistemic shock.
Yes, that profound collapse of meaning where the ground just drops out from under your fundamental belief system. If the intensity wasn't true, then what was it?
And the self searches for external factors.
Of course, blaming the other person, blaming the circumstances, anything to preserve the original belief that the feeling was truth. Admitting the feeling was just loud but temporary, or powerful but misplaced, is often too difficult.
So the enduring difficulty is holding that contradiction. That something can be profoundly felt, overwhelming, consume all your attention, and yet not correspond to a shared reality or an enduring meaning. It was real for you.
But it wasn't the truth. And the book forces you to acknowledge that feelings can lie, not intentionally, but simply by virtue of their sheer volume. Their authority is self-proclaimed, not earned through connection to objective facts.
Finally, let's connect the quiet lie and the unanswered questions that linger. This brings us back to how we manage ambiguity. The essay, The Lie That Made It Bearable, describes an internal, necessary adjustment.
And the lie is rarely spoken aloud to the other person. It's a softening, an internal accommodation or a self-deception. Like, this is fine, I can handle this casually, I can care later.
Just to get through the moment.
It allows the present to be inhabited without tearing the self in two. Its function is purely pragmatic, to allow the short term to exist when the long-term reality is unbearable. It's an act of emotional triage.
And this self-deception isn't malicious. It's a necessary mechanism for navigating complexity without an immediate emotional collapse.
Yes, and this accommodation relates directly to what sex left unanswered, where sex itself is asked to carry an unbearable weight of meaning.
We often ask sex to be a solution, don't we? To carry reassurance or certainty or the repair of a relationship or a personal wound.
A weight that is entirely misaligned with its structure, which is temporary and often inherently ambiguous.
And when it fails to deliver that profound relief, the disappointment is quiet, almost imperceptible.
Sex did not fail as an act, but it failed to become something else. A remedy, a conversation, a declaration of permanence. The experience is over, but the structural uncertainty remains.
And the lingering unanswered questions.
Yeah.
Did it matter to them? Or what was that strained, vulnerable self I glimpsed in that moment? They just resist resolution and remain suspended.
The sources observe that asking these questions too directly would collapse the fragile ambiguity that the relationship or the encounter depends on. And often, that ambiguity, though painful, is preferred to the finality of a clear, negative answer.
So you're left with this unclaimed presence, an experience that has not been successfully resolved into any recognizable, useful category.
It just is.
It's the ultimate ghost, the unresolved feeling that you are still carrying long after this physical encounter has ended.
What remains so compelling and I think so challenging about Pedro Malha's work and the entire Ghosts of Sex collection is this final, unwavering refusal to provide a position or a synthesis.
Right.
The essays just stop. They stop without gathering themselves into anything that can be conclusively named or measured or moved beyond.
It fundamentally rejects that inherent human desire for closure and for progress. The book leaves intact the instability we've been discussing this whole time. Wanting does not cancel knowing.
Recognition does not magically erase attachment.
Intensity does not clarify the truth. Proximity to these contradictions just exposes how often they coexist within us and how little warning there is when the emotional ground shifts under our feet.
And this ties back to the core philosophical stance of the ghost movement. It is an explicit, firm rejection of the idea that discomfort is merely a stage toward something better, or that naming an experience automatically dissolves its force or its power over you.
So acknowledgments in Malha's framework do not function as exits.
Not at all. The writing simply stays with the fact that people live inside these complex tensions without knowing what they are for or how long they must carry them.
The ultimate synthesis is that there is no synthesis. The book offers a record of emotional realities that refuse to align into a single view. It remains aware of its own incompleteness, and it's unwilling to be absorbed into some systematic explanation that would make it easier to hold or dismiss.
The essays end precisely where they began, inside lived emotional experience that does not resolve itself on command.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought.
It does. If seeing clearly does not necessarily mean seeing everything, and if articulating an emotion does not make that feeling manageable, what then is the value of simply remaining with the feeling, unaltered and uncorrected? That willingness to sit in the ambiguity, to recognize the ghost of the feeling without trying to exorcise it, That might just be the most honest form of clarity available to us in our intimate lives.
Something for you to mull over the next time you feel that peculiar friction between what you know and what you feel?